Good evening. I'd like to call the meeting to order and welcome you to the regular meeting of the Milwaukee Planning Commission. Agendas and additional copies of staff reports are available on the table in the hall. If you have not picked up an agenda, please do so. It contains important information about the process. If you wish to be included in the mailing list for a decision, please add your name and contact information to the sign-up list located on the table in the hallway. If you wish to testify tonight, please fill out a yellow comment card. We will follow the basic format listed on the back of the agenda. It includes all of the hearing procedure steps. We may vary from the process based on the specific circumstance of each hearing. Next on the agenda is approval of the minutes. But we do not have any minutes this time, so we're going to skip that. Informational items. Are there informational items from staff?
I have two. The council has their third continued hearing coming up on the North Milwaukee industrial area. It's happening next week. And then later in March, and I'm forgetting the date, is the volunteer appreciation dinner. Have you guys been invited to that yet? Okay, you will be getting an invitation from the city manager's office. I think it's the last week in March, but I could be wrong. That's probably spring break, right?
Yeah, that's spring break.
So that's probably not the week that it is, but you'll be getting a letter from them. But I wanted to just alert you that that'll be coming. So, yeah.
And the comprehensive plan update meeting is coming up too, right?
Thank you, Greg. Yeah, we have a comp plan advisory committee meeting next Monday. David just sent out links to the packet. I'm not sure if he sent them to the planning commission or not. He was supposed to. So make sure he does. Okay.
Thank you. I was going to cover that in the update section, but we've covered that already. Audience participation. This is an opportunity to comment on items not on tonight's agenda. If you wish to comment on an item that is on the agenda, there will be time for comments after the presentation. Does anyone wish to comment on an item that is not on tonight's agenda? The next agenda item is a public hearing on Rowe Middle School Improvements, file CSU-2017-007. Public hearing on CSU-2017-007 is called to order. The purpose of this hearing is to consider application number CSU-2017-007. The purpose of this application is to request a community service use amendment at 3606 Southeast Lake Road. The applicant has the burden of proving that the application is consistent with the City of Milwaukee's zoning, subdivision ordinance, comprehensive plan, and any applicable municipal code provision. The applicant has the burden of proving that the proposal conforms with all of the city's applicable criteria. I now ask staff to cite the zoning ordinance sections where the criteria can be found.
Those applicable sections are from Milwaukee Municipal Code, subsection 19.1006, type 3 review, section 19.904, community service uses, chapter 19.301, low density residential zones, including the R10 zone, chapter 19.500, supplementary development regulations, chapter 19.600, off-street parking and loading, and chapter 19.700, public facility improvements.
All testimony and evidence must be directed toward the applicable substantive criteria. Failure to address a criterion or raise an issue with sufficient detail to allow Planning Commission an adequate opportunity to respond to each issue precludes appeal to the City Council based on that issue. failure to raise constitutional or other issues related to the proposed conditions of approval with sufficient detail to allow a response precludes an action for damages in circuit court. Any party with standing may appeal the decision of the Planning Commission to City Council. Persons with standing are those who submit written comments or testify in person or sign the Planning Commission attendance sign-up sheet in the hallway. Conduct of the hearing. I will recognize those persons who have completed the testimony cards and given them to me. When you come to the podium, please state your name and address for the record so they may be entered into the minutes. If you are here to testify, please remember to confine your remarks to the application and the relevant criteria and to avoid repetition and irrelevant information. If additional documents or evidence are provided by any party, the Commission may, if requested, allow a continuance or leave the record open to allow parties a reasonable opportunity to respond. Any such continuance or extension shall be the subject to the limitations of the 120-day rule unless the continuance or extension is requested or agreed to by the applicant. Does any member of the Planning Commission wish to abstain from this hearing?
No.
Does any member of the Planning Commission wish to declare an actual or potential conflict of interest?
No.
Does any member of the Planning Commission wish to report on any ex parte contacts?
No.
No.
Will any commissioner who has visited the site prior to this hearing please raise their hand? Did any of those commissioners who visited the site speak to anyone at the site or note anything different from what is indicated in the staff report for this application?
No.
Does any member of the audience wish to challenge the participation of any member of the Planning Commission? Jurisdictional issues. Does any member of the audience wish to challenge the jurisdiction of the Planning Commission to hear this matter? Let's proceed to the staff report presentation.
All right, good evening, Madam Chair, Commissioners. I'm Brett Kelver, Associate Planner with the City of Milwaukee. I'll be walking you through this application tonight. So this is the first of a series of community service use modifications for several of the school sites in the city that are related to the 2016 bond that was passed for improvements. So we'll get better and better at this as we go, I think. So Rowe's the first up. I think you're all familiar with the location of the middle school. Just the one middle school within the city limits. It's located on Lake Road. It's located within an R10 zoned area, and we can refer back to these images if needed. The applicant can give you more detail if you desire about what's involved with the proposed upgrades and changes to the school site. We have a short list here. There are some additions that are happening at a couple portions of the building that's resulting in part in an increase of the classrooms by 2. The changes, at least in one of the locations where an addition is happening, is going to displace some existing parking spaces, so there'll be a slight reduction in parking. In the field area, there's going to be the erection of a covered structure over a play area that'll be in the spot where there is currently a portion of one ball field. They're going to remove a couple basketball courts and add 2 tennis courts, and make some upgrades to the baseball field that's on the southwest corner of the field part of the site. The tennis courts and that upgraded ball field, as we understand it, will be used to serve for some of the high school athletic activities. Here's a map that's showing more or less where some of those project elements are happening. One of the changes marked by number 1 is an addition at the main entry to the building. Number 2 is the addition to the southwest portion of the building where there'll be some removal of parking spaces. Number 3 shows where there's an existing courtyard area that will be partially filled in for additional building space. Number 4 shows the approximate location of the covered play area that will be established on the field site. Number 5 shows you where 2 additional tennis courts will be added. And number 6 indicates the field that will be upgraded for use by the high school junior varsity baseball. Just for reference, there are a couple of photos. I'll start with the upper left and work clockwise around. So that's the first one is a shot of kind of looking from east to west at the main building entrance, moving clockwise. The next shot is a view of the parking area that was added in 2010. This is accessible off Shell Lane and it's kind of on the east side of the building. The lower, southeast quadrant of photos shows that is looking from west to east, kind of across the front of the building where in 2007, some of the upgrades to the school included establishment of this kind of bus turnaround, pull-in and turnaround area. And then in the southwest quadrant, this is showing the southwest portion of the building where an addition will happen and there'll be some parking displaced. We have a couple shots of the athletic fields. These are from Google Maps from the Shell Lane, and they show the kind of the upper left one shows kind of from closer to the corner almost of Shell Lane and Lake Road, looking towards the middle school, so looking towards the southwest, showing the existing tennis courts, and you can see a little bit of kind of the existing conditions of Shell Lane. And then the lower photo is showing kind of just from a little farther south on Shell Lane and kind of moving a little bit closer to the driveway entrance to the parking area that's on the east side of the school site. For reference, we have the list of criteria that we reviewed at the beginning of the presentation, and we've highlighted for the presentation tonight 3 of the 4 key issues that were listed in the staff report, and I'll walk you through them real quickly. So what we're calling for tonight key issue A, are the existing transportation facilities sufficient for the proposed development? Key issue B involves parking. Is the parking going to be sufficient for what's going to be happening at the school site? And C, do the proposed athletic field improvements satisfy the community service use or CSU approval criteria? So one by one. Key issue A, let's talk about the existing transportation facilities. There was some discussion as late as today. You got some communication from the applicant raising some of their perspective about the draft findings and conditions of approval. And the staff, I guess some staff response and a proposed revised finding kind of related to this. And we can certainly talk about this more now, or if you want to hear what the applicant has to say, and we can come back up and discuss it. But essentially, the understanding is that the additions, the square footage of the additions to the building are enough to warrant improvements to those frontages of the school property on public street that are not already at city standard. When we look at Lake Road, we see that it has already been built to city standard, and so when we look at Shell Lane, we can see that a portion of the site is falls well below city standards. So that's where the focus of the required transportation facility improvements has been. Here are a couple photos for reference now or later. These are views. Let's see, the larger photo on the left is kind of showing you looking south down Shell Lane. You can see essentially where Shell Lane almost becomes like a one-lane road. This is right at where the 2 driveway entrances to the eastern parking area are located. And then the stacked photos on the right show you views looking from farther south on Shell Lane, looking towards the north, so back towards Lake Road. So from this much less improved portion of Shell Lane. So the lower photo on the right is from farther south on Shell Lane, and then the upper photo on the right is showing you a little bit closer to the spot where the two driveways come in. Previously, with the upper right-hand photo, if we could shift our gaze a little bit towards the left in the photo, towards the west, that site previously had a single-family house on it, and the district bought that property, and that is the area where the 2010 parking lot was added. Just again for aerial reference, here is a view of this portion of Shell Lane. I'll see if I can get the cursor to work here. So it's a little bit hard to see these. These lines represent, here's the Shell Lane right-of-way, and you can see it remains a consistent width until we get a little bit farther south. This is well beyond the area where the road narrows, but you can see that the actual right-of-way width is quite a bit narrower here. So part of the proposed requirements would include some dedication of the remaining portion of the school property to the right-of-way, as well as some improvements on Shell Lane as well. And again, we can come back to this if it's helpful for reference. You can see that there are approximately 4 properties right now that kind of stretch farther south on the other side of Shell Lane. The southernmost one, this one here, is actually redevelopable. It's large enough that it could be split in the R10 zone to establish either to establish a duplex if you wanted to add on to that existing house, or fully redevelop the site and have 2 single-family homes there. Key issue B deals with parking. And just to kind of retrace where we are on the site and where it's going, the current site provides 89 parking spaces. With the 1 building addition in the southwest, 8 of those spaces will be removed. That'll drop the number to 81. As was discussed in the staff report, in 2010, when the school developed the additional parking lot on the east side of the street, that process involved a parking adjustment. So the school at that time made an argument that even though what the code said, the maximum number of parking spaces should be based on the number of classrooms that they had at the time, that they demonstrated a need for additional parking. And so the number that was set in 2010 was for 85 spaces. Over time, the numbers changed a little bit to 89. Maybe the district or the applicant can explain a little bit about that. But what's happening with the project is the number is dropping back below that maximum number that was approved in 2010, so below the 85 count. And I think the feeling of staff, and I'll get to it, I guess, maybe more with key issue C, is that with the proposed addition to the building and the understanding of the use of the athletic fields, I think the feeling of staff is that the existing parking for the site should be adequate for the uses that we can expect to see on the site. And expanding beyond the parking, just a consideration of the athletic fields and how they're going to be used. We just wanted to highlight that there's no proposal for lighting of the site, so it's going to be continued to be used for daytime activities only. So activities for the school, physical education, recess, as well as activities by, in this case, it'll be adding some high school activities, but also general community activities that have happened on the site as well during daytime use. So again, our assessment of the situation is that the parking will be adequate for those uses, and then with the improvements that are recommended on Shell Lane, that the access and circulation will be adequate as well. So essentially, the staff recommendation is to approve the community service use, the requested modification to it, and to adopt the findings and conditions of approval that are presented in your packet. And you have kind of the standard set of options for decision making. You can decide to go with those findings and recommend conditions of approval. Based on your discussion, you may decide that you want to make some modifications to those, and we'll just try to capture those as best we can and make sure we're clear about those and get them read into the record. If you decide that you need more time, another option is to continue the hearing, or you can direct staff to develop findings for denial of the application. So I thought you might ask me some questions while I was doing the presentation, so I asked if you had any additional questions, but if you have any questions, period, I'll take them now.
Any questions for staff?
Well, my only question is that I take it Exhibit 1 is the proposed, so you're not saying that's what's in the packet, but what, canceling out what's in the packet and putting in Exhibit 1 is what you're recommending, correct?
The intention of Exhibit 1 was to propose specific changes to the specific finding that is numbered there. I think it's number 10.
Yes.
Yeah. 10D.
And preserving the remainder of the findings as well. So this doesn't represent a complete set of the findings, but it's a proposed change to that one specific. Right? It's a 10D and a one-word change in 10E as well.
Brett, I do have one question regarding the square footage. So the development is proposing an additional almost 12,000 square feet. What's the threshold that triggers that, the street improvements? Do you know?
I might call on Alex from engineering to come up, and I'll start my answer. Or as a way of intro. So the question is, how is it more or less how many square feet would it take to trigger improvements?
One of the approval criteria in 19700 is increase in trips, is kind of one of the simplest ones to calculate. Usually that's an empty site with a brand new house on it. They have to put sidewalk in. Sometimes it might just be a slight increase for a commercial site and they already have some sidewalks, so nothing gets built. Part of the analysis that we go through is determining proportionality, so or rough proportionality. If you're increasing by one trip, you don't need to build 600 feet of sidewalk. We can't ask for that. So it depends. It's not always a clear-cut determination.
But it's fair to say that based on the type of use, that is, in this case, a middle school, when we look at the ITE manual and see how calculations are made about estimated trips, they're related to square footage. So if a different number of square feet were being proposed, that would be run through the calculator and it would produce a different estimate of trips, higher or lower, depending on whether it's more or less square footage. So if you're trying to get at how many square feet of addition would it take to generate, I guess, a requirement, is it fair to say that the way we've been understanding for the frontage on Shell Lane that is not improved to city standard, it's about 400 feet?
Correct.
Is that right? So we understand that on average, one new trip, like what you get from a single-family house, one new trip
During that PM peak hour.
during the PM peak is sufficient to warrant improvements to approximately 50 feet of frontage. So if the question is, if you have 400 feet of frontage that might need improving, then the math would say if you hit 8 estimated trips, that would be enough to require improvements on Shell Lane. What square footage number for the building that would have to be, I'm not sure.
Well, yeah, high school has a different trip generation rate per 1,000 square feet as elementary as a middle school. And that depends on, driving and busing. And in this case, the 11,800 ends up being almost exactly 14 new trips.
So we could figure that maybe if you had about half the square footage or a little bit more than half the square footage, you'd probably be close to an estimate of 8 new trips, and that would be enough.
Sure. Okay. Thanks.
Alex, can you state your name, please?
Alex Roller with Milwaukee Engineering.
Thanks.
So in practicality, though, we're adding 2 classrooms or not adding any classrooms? Was it adding 2?
It's adding 2 classrooms with the configuration they're proposing, right?
And so the additional square footage is just kind of shared space. It's not really, other than the 2 classrooms. So we're not talking about, just in practicality, as far as city code is concerned, I know what the ITE trip generation manual says, but as far as city code is concerned, the standard is 2 per classroom as a maximum.
We're talking about parking.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so, trip generation versus parking. It's kind of, interrelated. So we're not really talking about more, in practicality, we're not really talking about more trips because we're just talking about a couple extra classrooms, and we're also trying to mitigate that through the conditions that would require some carpool parking, correct? So I'm just wondering, I'm just trying to balance this out. When you look further south down the dead-end street, beyond the entrance to the parking lot, there's a total of, you said, 4 properties, and only one of those has capacity to be divided further?
That's correct.
Are there any emergency response concerns about the state of the street the way that it's designed right now?
We haven't received any responses. I do know that it is below standard. We were approached by the homeowner at the end about wanting to do an ADU, and I did contact the fire department, and they said that they would require a turnaround. Kind of varied depending if it was attached or detached, but it is below standard right now. It's above their minimum distance for requiring a turnaround right now.
So the turnaround is the consideration, not necessarily the width of the right-of-way or the width of the.
I'm not sure. I know that their width requirement is 20 foot clear, and that may be what's there right now.
Yeah,
but
I think
they do allow gravel, but it might be barely that width right now.
Okay.
And keep in mind that we don't look at what's being built inside of a building. We look at the use. We look at and what's going in there. Sometimes we can itemize it out, like if we have a warehouse and then also a retail. Those two do get their separate calculations, but we don't go the other way. If they divided a bunch of the rooms and now they have 60 classrooms, we don't charge them anymore for SDCs. It's still the same square footage.
And I think it's worth noting as well, just as an example of what can happen over time, from 2010, when the proposal for parking quantity adjustment and the modification to establish the parking there, the numbers that were presented at that time were 37 classrooms. The number has somehow over time changed to 31. So I think that speaks a little bit to the idea or the methodology of focusing on the square footage of the particular use, that things can shift around, space can be reconfigured inside a building, and the idea is that that manual and those calculations have been based on some kind of collective generalized understandings of impact for that type of use, so that in this case, if you're not changing, in general, if you're not changing the size of the building, we're not expecting additional trips. So that's why, even though it's a very fair question to ask, how is, this is even fewer classrooms than we talked about in 2010, but the size of the building is increasing, and obviously that gives more room for other changes to happen in the future.
Do you want to talk about the improvements at all in the process for determining what the proper improvements are?
Yep. So our public works standards, as well as the code, lays out kind of the maximum requirements that we want for right of way, based on the width. There is some variability within that sometimes we don't require parking. A lot of the streets don't have bike lanes, so there's different width requirements and just component requirements, in the improvements. So we aren't laying down an exact requirement as you've seen. We didn't say 5-foot sidewalks, 5-foot planter, 23 feet of asphalt or anything like that. We understand that there can be some variability, and there's some large trees that, we could have the sidewalk be set back further or something. The sidewalk can be an easement, so there's a lot of wiggle room in still following the code and, still calling it a full improvement. So,
just following on that question, given that there's some flexibility, can you describe the extent of the frontage improvements we're talking about? Is it curb and gutter? Is it curb, gutter, planter, and sidewalk? Is it curb, gutter, bike lane, and half street, full street? What are we talking about in terms of the extent of improvement?
I mean, like, what would the starting point be, or what would the code?
We're imposing a condition that says we're going to build an improvement. Mm-hmm. We need to be able to say what the extent of it is. So we because it's being contested, so we need to be able to identify. Is it a full street? Is it a half street? What is it?
It would be a 2/3 street is what we'd be looking for. It could be no parking. I think we feel that would work I haven't actually, confirmed this with the engineering director who's actually sitting right behind me right now. But we would allow for the sidewalk to be set back, and it could meander even. I mean, the sidewalk can be on an easement on their property. But it would be curb, gutter, asphalt, depending on parking or not, would change. Parking's 6 feet.
Okay, thanks.
I had a question about a performance bond. I noticed that's in the conditions, and I'm not familiar with that. Can you explain what that means?
For all of our public improvements, when they begin the process, we finalize the plans, get a cost estimate, say it's $100,000. We get a bond from a bonding company to, back that improvement. In the case that they start work and get a third the way through it and they just leave, we can use that bond to go get a contractor and finish the improvements. So it does cost money to get the bond, and it's based on how much it is. So it's a certain amount per month to keep it.
Thank you. And then another question I had was about the PM peak. What is that? What is the PM peak for this project?
What's the time?
Yeah, what is the time?
We try to go, there's usually two different categories in the ITE manual. Sometimes they only have PM peak, and that's just, kind of 5-ish. Other times they have, weekday PM between 4 and 6. And if we can get that, then we'll use that through all of our calculations. If we don't have one of those in one of the categories, then we'll find one that we'll have. So in this case, we had the between 4 and 6 p.m. on a weekday. And that's kind of the important one.
Yeah.
Sometimes churches have a low number because they're all on the weekend, but we care about the peak times on the transportation system.
Yeah.
On a weekday.
Yeah. Any additional questions for staff?
I have one. Does the addition of the tennis courts and improvements to the ball fields, does that impact trip count at all? Or is it strictly square footage?
When we first looked at the site, we tried going down that path to figure out, what is this impact? We knew, thinking about it, we knew there would be an increased impact. Right now it's just recess, but it's going to function as, weekday practice as well as, more high school practice and events. But as we looked at what the increased trip count would be just from the school improvement, we kind of went off that track. We didn't need to account for that because the number of trips we had proportionality-wise already got us to the improvements on shell, and we didn't need to go any further. So that trip count for the school does incorporate fields somewhat. If they were building 15 tennis courts, we might have a question, but there is some built-in numbers in that existing trip count.
I'll add that I think it's fair to say there are several things that are interrelated here. I mean, we are talking about there's trip generation, there's what Commissioner Edge noted, the parking requirement related to square footage and usage. And you're also looking at the community service use, question of impacts of use of the site on the neighborhood and surrounding area. And especially, I think, for that consideration, it probably becomes a lot more relevant to think about how the field portion of the site has been used in the past and how that use will change to understand that. In terms of the calculation of trip generation and how that impacts required street improvements, it's a little bit easier to focus that and focus our argument on the understanding of the building square footage addition. That makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Thank you. Have we received any correspondence on this matter other than those items included in the meeting packet?
Just the items that we distributed to you via email earlier today and kind of by hard copy today, the letter from the applicant and the staff exhibit with the revised
Applicant testimony. Comments from the applicant or their representative? Please state your name for the record. Thanks.
Good evening. David Hobbs, Capital Projects Director for North Clackamas School District, address 444 Southeast Lake Road.
Good evening, Madam Chair. For the record, Andrew Tull with 3J Consulting. Our address is 5075 Southwest Griffith Drive, Suite 150 in Beaverton, Oregon, 97005. Thank you so much for having us here tonight. We do have a brief presentation to run through, and then we have an issue to talk about with regards to right-of-way improvements. But I will also just take a moment to introduce the project manager for this school, which is Mark Bargenda sitting in the back. Also, Brian Feeney is here from 3J Consulting. He'll be the project manager for the engineering and design of this going forward. I want to thank you again for your time tonight. I know you're volunteers, and we certainly appreciate you being here and representing the city. Also want to take just a moment to thank staff for their efforts in getting us to this point. It's never easy to make a land use application. As you can see, it's a giant binder, a lot of complications, and we always appreciate working with the City of Milwaukee staff. So with that, I'll just hit the road here and talk about the improvements. I think Brett did a very good job of explaining the improvements that are being proposed at Rowe Middle School. Not all classrooms are being affected. It's really a modernization of some of the more common facilities that are present within the building, renovation of the commons and kitchen, an expansion of the media center. There are 2 classrooms that are going to be added, and then there's some administrative areas that are coming on as well. In addition to that, there's going to be a lot of window replacement, re-siding, re-roofing, and the doors are going to be upgraded throughout the building. With regard to the field improvements, we are doing 2 new tennis courts, covered play area with asphalt or concrete surface, a new baseball / softball field. I think it's now programmed that's going to be the JV baseball's practice field. I'll try to slow down a little bit. It'll have new dugouts, new backstops. There'll be a soccer field that sort of overlaps the baseball field as well. That soccer field is really going to be used for lunchtime play or recess play. And then also a new shot put and discus throw pads. The Summer Olympics are going to come right up on us, and who knows who's going to be interested in that. So just a side-by-side to show you what's there now. And if this cursor's working, which it appears to be, you can see that the main additions are focused in this area in the southwest. This is where a little bit of the parking will be displaced. And then we're sort of closing the courtyard here between the existing and the proposed plans. And then I just have an updated look at the building, and we really can't read what these are, but it gives you an idea of sort of what we're thinking. And then this is the detail showing the field improvements, and you can see the 2 tennis courts that are going in up on the northern edge. This is the new JV baseball field with all of the amenities that'll go along with that, the new covered play area, and then the overlapping soccer field. So, as you've noted in our correspondence today, we appreciate staff working with us on this, but I think the district is unprepared at this point to undertake improvements to Shell Lane, and we're respectfully requesting the removal of condition of approval 2. Obviously, I omitted the number 2 in that little part of the slide, if you'll forgive me, but if we removed condition of approval 2, it would remove the requirement to complete improvements to the subject section of Shell Lane. And I'm going to jump ahead in my presentation, and then I'm going to come back to this slide. So I'm on slide 6, but I'm going to jump ahead to 11 because this is important to discuss. If the commission is so inclined to leave the conditions of approval as they are written tonight, we still have a couple of issues that we want to get out on the table and discuss, because as they're written, it's not necessarily the conditions, but it's the section below the conditions with the additional requirements that are giving us a little bit of concern. So comment 1C in those additional concerns would require a right-of-way permit for public improvements prior to the issuance of building permits. We intend, the building season for us starts the moment that school gets out, and all of the improvements, all the plans that we've drawn up to this point exclude Shell Lane, and we're 100% confident that we cannot get Shell Lane ready and have a right-of-way permit-ready set of plans or engineered plans, as it speaks to comment 1D, prior to having our plans ready for the actual building permit for the on-site work. So we would be asking you to consider separating comments 1C and 1D out into a separate part of the additional requirements and tying it to a date certain. We would propose February 27th, 2019. So instead of tying it to the building permit, you tie it to a date certain in the future, and that gives us some time to get started on the school. In the meantime, we could work on the Shell Lane improvements. So if there's any questions at the end of the presentation about that, I'm happy to discuss it, but we're hopeful that we can share some of our reasoning about why we don't think we're required to work on Shell Lane, and maybe you'll agree with us tonight. So Shell Lane, I think staff did a great job of sort of setting the stage here, but not only Shell Lane, but a lot of the roads off of Lake Road going into the residential districts in this area are unimproved or underimproved. It's a very semi-rural sort of setting. Large lots, you don't have a lot of sidewalks. In this picture on the top, you can see the school really is the only property that does have a sidewalk. And I think this speaks to when the school went in, safety was a concern, getting folks up to Shell Lane, obviously, and they sort of did what made sense. That entrance is right here into the school's parking lot. It's the only entrance to the school from this side of the property, and so they stopped the sidewalk improvements there because they didn't anticipate anybody walking any farther down Shell Lane to use the school. When a city goes to make an extraction or ask for frontage improvements or ask for any sort of off-site improvements. These are a little long, so I'll leave this slide up here, but this is really important information in this situation. The city has to make and establish a connection between any conditions they wish to impose and the rough proportionality of the impacts from the proposed project. In order to require frontage improvements, the city needs to make an individual determination that the required improvements are related both in nature and extent to the proposed development's impacts. So what that means is if we're having an impact on the school property and you're going to make a frontage improvement requirement, you have to be able to draw a line between the people who are using it and the improvement that you're asking for. Sort of one of the main points of our argument is we just don't anticipate anybody walking along here. There's no destinations except for a couple of existing houses, and the majority of the neighborhood gets along just fine sort of in this semi-rural environment. The letter that we submitted to you today makes another couple of points. When you prepare a transportation impact analysis or a transportation impact statement, which we weren't required to do on this project, it was small enough that we thought we weren't going to be impacting the system to the level where we really needed to explore the impacts on intersections up and downstream from the property. But when you start that, you always get credit for what you have. So if you have a giant warehouse and you're going to convert it to something else, you have to assume that that warehouse had a potential based upon the building square footage for a certain number of trips. In the ITE manual, and this is detailed in the letter, not only are schools, both elementary, middle, and high schools called out with different trip generation rates, but so are baseball fields, so are tennis courts. All of that is sort of detailed in the analysis that we've shown you. And as we look at the comparison based upon the existing potential impacts that we have on the system versus what's being proposed, where we add 2 tennis courts, take away a baseball field, add building square footage, we get a net overall impact of 3.7 PM peak hour trips. The rough proportionality section of the city's code tells you to not only look at the impacts, but also look at mitigations that are being proposed along with the proposed impacts. The mitigations that we've outlined in our letter are that this is going to be a high school practice facility both for tennis and for JV baseball, and the district's program does include a plan to put a bus at the school prior to practice, get as many students as want to ride over, and then to bus them back after. So instead of having, there is no actual ITE calculation for a baseball field. There is for a soccer field, but because they have the same number of players and coaches, we typically use them sort of interchangeably. So instead of having 17 trips coming over and leaving, you're going to have a bus coming over, and maybe you're going to have one student or one coach who drives. The programming of the school is an intrinsic sort of mitigation to any potential additional trips that having the JV practice facility here would normally have. I wanted to conclude this with that little statement above, and just note that staff acknowledges that this is a low-impact development. Their comment in the staff report was that the character of the school will not change appreciably, and no adverse impacts to the neighborhood are anticipated. I'll talk just a bit about Shell Lane, and this is the survey. It might be just a little difficult to read, but I think it really very clearly illustrates this right-of-way issue. So here's the property that has development potential, and this is the right-of-way as it exists today. This meets the city's standard as far as I believe it does, but you really need a 25-foot dedication here in order to give, let's say if this applicant were to come in and develop, they may or may not have enough room here to get a full fire permissible access through. The district is willing to dedicate that 25 feet of right-of-way at this time. It's one of the conditions of approval. We're happy to accept it. With regard to fire access, Alex was absolutely right. The fire marshal typically does require 20 foot of clear access area, but it doesn't necessarily always have to be paved. It doesn't have to be 20 feet wide. Sometimes they'll do 14 feet of pavement with 2-foot shoulders on each side of the road. Sometimes they'll work on any number of adjustments based upon existing development conditions, but they'll probably ask you to sprinkle the buildings. They may ask you for an alternative methods and materials submission, saying that you're going to sprinkle your garages, you're going to put on fireproof siding. You're going to have to acknowledge that because of existing development conditions, you may have a delay in service. All of that's possible, and fire marshals are very realistic about existing conditions and the opportunities they present for access. So I would say, in addition to the right-of-way, we're also willing to work with the city on what a future turnaround would look like, which would give that property, if it were to develop, some options down the road. In summary, the district respectfully requests an amendment to the staff report and conditions of approval to remove references to improvements to Shell Lane. The Shell Lane improvements, in our opinion, are not justified by the nature and extent of the improvements proposed at Rowe. The district's request is justified because there will be no additional traffic using the portion of Shell Lane in question. And even if there is additional traffic using Shell Lane, I think our letter has described it's going to be fairly insignificant. If I've missed anything, which sometimes I certainly do, I want to give David the opportunity to chime in and fill in any gaps. But if not, we're here to answer any questions, and we would invite you to enter into deliberation with us if you would, because this is a significant issue for us in terms of timing for the existing project, and we'd like to be able to discuss and help out with any changes to the conditions of approval so that we can make sure that we can start on time when school ends.
And just one item I would add to the great presentation that Andrew just did is our permit, our initial permit that we're planning to pull is actually in May for some demolition. So that condition of approval as it currently exists around the Shell Lane improvements and having the engineered plans and permit in place is going to be next to impossible for us to achieve and still hit our start of construction in May of this year. That's really, really challenging for us. If we don't hit that start, we're probably at least a year delayed on our project, which is really going to be challenging for the district. Thank you.
Thank you. Questions for the applicant?
I have a question. So just to clarify, are you requesting that item number 2 be fully stricken, or that it be modified to allow pulling these permits and development of the school as planned, and then the right-of-way improvements would happen next year?
That's a good question. I think our preference would be to have condition of approval 2 taken out. It has in addition to a timing impact, it has a budget impact on this overall project, which has not been factored in and has really sort of brought us to the point where we felt like we needed to contest it.
Can you speak to at what point in the project, or maybe a date when you were first notified of this condition?
I think the staff report is dated February 23rd.
Okay, and that's the first point of notification.
I think we were aware that staff may be contemplating a condition of approval regarding Shell Lane. However, we submitted our application with findings intact that stated we didn't believe we were meeting the proportionality test, and therefore we didn't think that the city should apply improvement requirements to our application.
Okay, thank you.
I have a couple of questions not related to that really, but related to parking. So can you talk a little bit about your understanding of not needing as many parking spaces and how that's different from 2010 when you asked for 85 parking spaces, and just talk a little bit about your feeling that, you know, with carpool spaces that could be mitigated, and have you talked to your staff about this, and just making sure that that's been addressed, because each time I visit the school, the parking lots are completely full, and that includes the one that you're going to be getting rid of on the southeast side.
Mm-hmm. David, do you want to cover that?
I can cover part of it, I think. You know, the prime, and I'm not sure exactly what time you visited the school. Typically, it's those evening after-hour events when all the parents come into the school that we have parking challenges at the school. I think that we have been working very closely with the principal and staff around parking. Parking for our staff and our teachers is always a really critical issue that they're very concerned about. I think the carpool mitigation, I think we have 3 spots that are proposed in here for carpool is an opportunity to mitigate some of that effort in there. And again, we've been working with the school as closely as we can and their staff associated with that.
Yeah,
So.
my question is more about the staff and the employees at the school. I've been to the after hours, and of course we have to walk quite a ways to get there, and that's not, you know, an issue. But I think about the employees that are there day to day, and they're needing to now use more street parking, and I just am a little bit concerned about the reduction of eight parking spots, quite honestly. So
I think we would gladly ask for more parking at this point. I mean, just hearing the district talk about this project and the demand for parking at all of their schools, we have this limitation that is based upon code criteria. This school got the modification and is above that criteria, or above that standard, but I think at some point you may see us even come back and ask for more if it becomes a problem.
Correct, yeah.
I'm sorry, I'm confused. So you will be above the standard even with the reduction?
We are. We're an existing non-conforming use because we're above the standard, but it was permitted as part of that modification in 2007.
Okay. Thanks for the clarification. I misunderstood that. And then I do have one more question about the timing for the use of the fields, given that the school day ends at 4:05, and, you know, what is the anticipated, said between 4 and 6:30 the fields would be used. So thinking about safety for students departing the school, and then, you know, the timing for the other kids to be on the field, and can you address the assurances that there would be safety addressed during those times?
Sure. Yeah, the safety is obviously of foremost concern. Part of the reason that, again, we've come up with a plan for bringing buses over from Milwaukee High to utilize the field is primarily to limit traffic and the amount of traffic in terms of overlap for the kids. A single bus versus 15 to 20 cars obviously minimizes that impact, both for parking and congestion, as well as for traffic of the students coming in and out. The normal bus will drop into the bus lane and be able to drop the players off and get them off onto the field, and really have limited disruption to any safety concerns with the middle schoolers leaving at the end of the day.
So practice will not start until the middle schoolers are gone.
I think we said 4 o'clock is their intention is 4 to 6:30 in that window. So there is a 5-minute overlap in there in which the bus shows up, as do our other buses that serve the middle school. We already have buses coming onto the site to pick up the middle schoolers, so it's really not an issue in terms of the traffic coming on board. And obviously the players coming over are supervised by their coaches on there, which are add to, again, the safety factor.
Okay. Any questions for the applicant? No? Oh, I did have one more question. So you don't anticipate hiring additional FTE for these classrooms, or so the same number of employees and staff will be using the facility?
From talking with the district, it sounds like what's happening at this particular school is kind of what you want to have happen at every school. You want more room, fewer students per classroom, and more modern facilities. I mean, this is not going to generate, I don't think, any need for new teachers. It's just going to allow students to spread out.
Right. We don't see any projection of growth in enrollment at Rowe anytime in the foreseeable future. I think it's going to be stable, perhaps even declining, depending on what model we look at. But really, it's, as Andrew said, it's about expansion. That school is cramped. People are just on top of each other. It's a revitalization, the entire project of the school, and really expanding that, getting safety corridors and other things to provide better flow within the school, and these additional spaces really to free up the spaces for more traditional uses that we have. So we're not anticipating adding students or staff in the building.
Okay. If there are no further questions,
sorry, I have one. And this, maybe I should have asked this earlier of staff. Has there been any commentary or any interaction with the 4 adjacent property owners that would be affected by the 2/3 street improvements?
Not by the district. As Andrew mentioned, we've had the staff report for about 4 days now, so we have not had any interaction with the neighbors on Shell Lane.
We did have a neighborhood meeting prior to submitting the application, and it was very sparsely attended, and I don't think the attendees lived on Shell Lane.
Okay. Thanks.
Thank you. Other testimony in support of the application. Do we have anyone who wishes to speak in support of the application? Testimony of those opposed to the application. Do we have anyone who wishes to speak in opposition of the application? If you have a yellow card anywhere, you have a yellow card. Okay. Come on up and state your name, and I'll take that yellow card.
Oh, don't I get to use it?
Oh, you can use it. Okay, and then you give it to me. Yeah, all right. So state your name and address, please.
Hi, my name's Howard Lanoff. I live at 12577 Southeast Boss Lane. And my concern about it is that space, about putting in the covered area, takes away a lot of the space. It's not a large space already. And putting in the 2 tennis courts, I think that's fine, because I think we need it. And the covered area we need too. But I'm not in favor of it, but I do think it's needed. So I'm really torn between those 2 ideas. I like having that large space. It's really nice. And then I do have a question about Shell Lane. There's that big tree on the side where the old house used to be. Is that going to stay there? Or is that going to be, that area going to be used? I wasn't clear on that. So that's a question for now.
Okay.
That I have. Can I get that answer now?
The answer is we don't know.
But it looks like the tree's in the way.
Yes.
Oh.
We'll answer that when we get a chance to respond.
Okay. And I wasn't also clear on where the classrooms are going to be added, the 2 new classrooms.
believe that's on the southeastern corner. Southwestern corner.
On the southwest.
Yes.
Southwest, so that's behind the school?
The school, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay. All right. All right. I think that's good.
Okay. Hold on. Any questions for
Howard Lanoff?
No, okay.
Okay, because I walk through there with my dog a lot.
Yeah.
And that's why I like having more space, and there's a lot of dog walkers that use that. And there's not many open areas in Milwaukee for doing that, and it seems like the spaces are getting smaller now, and that's not easy to stomach. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Do we have anyone who wishes to offer neutral testimony? Okay. Does any member of the Planning Commission have any questions regarding the testimony to this point?
Yes. Brett, can I have you up here to the... So if that back property on Shell Lane, I'm directionally challenged, so I can't give you northwest. I'm going to call it the back property on Shell Lane. If it were to split and redevelop, would they have to do the right-of-way?
That property would be responsible for some right-of-way improvements.
Would it have to do the 25 feet?
I think that in general, and I may ask Alex to help me out, in general, we're looking to get right-of-way in configurations that keeps the alignment of the existing right-of-way. So hang on a second, let me get to an image here. So I think, I apologize, it's a little bit hard to see this line, but here's the existing line on the east side of the right-of-way, and then I think it bumps over a little bit for this property, and then we have right-of-way and then the school property. So what we'd ideally like to do is, if we're getting dedication, we want to keep the alignment of the right-of-way. So this property, if it's split, would dedicate some property, but they're not going to dedicate 25 feet onto their site in order to keep to establish a 50-foot right-of-way or whatever that number would be. They would dedicate some to keep the alignment. So if we're missing an opportunity right now to get some dedication of right-of-way because of the school improvements and impacts, then it would make it more challenging and awkward. I'm not sure how we would handle it. Let's just say, maybe a fair question is, if the school wasn't doing anything right now and this person decided to split their lot, what would we get from them?
Would you make them do all the way down to the whole frontage of Shell Lane? Would you only make them go so far?
Well, I guess just to be clear, the city's not asking for improvements all the way to the end of Shell Lane. We're talking about kind of the end of their driveway, kind of halfway through that bottom property.
Brett, could you put your cursor at the stopping point where they're asking for the improvements?
Well, hold on. When we're asking for the right-of-way dedication, can we clarify, are we asking for dedication all the way down?
No.
Okay. So the dedication would stop where, like here?
Yes. Yep.
More or less.
But what about the improvements to the sidewalk?
Same place. That's the southern.
Okay,
end.
so it would seem to me that if that property develops, that you would require some improvements to the sidewalk, at least on one side or the other. And so how far down do you think that would have to go if that property develops?
I think we keep that same endpoint for any property that develops. They would dedicate kind of a...
You're going to have to get them, come back to the mic, though.
So, yeah, the end point of either property's improvements and dedication requirements would be kind of halfway through, kind of the front of that house, approximately.
But
No, they would not be responsible for as much dedication as the school would be, just because of the existing configuration. If it was swapped, one would be responsible for more than the other.
So we'd be looking at 5 or 10 feet from this property because that would keep the alignment of the right-of-way.
Correct.
And this property would be responsible for dedicating and improving in such a way as to establish a turnaround, right? Or a portion of a cul-de-sac or something like that here. Is that correct?
I thought we also talked about hard surface back to the asphalted.
Yeah, there would be minimum requirements for improving the road to their new lot.
So from here.
Yes.
It's actually paved partway back.
Yeah, some of it is paved.
So a simple partition or construction of a duplex on the lot at the end of the road, that property owner would be responsible for improving the roadway in front of everybody else's lots up to the point where it's improved.
Some minimal
There's a minimal improvement of 16 feet of asphalt, just 2 8-foot travel lanes to get to their lot, and then that's where their frontage improvements happen.
Okay. Now, my next question is, would that tree have to be removed?
Which tree? This tree?
How about everyone that crosses through that blue line?
Right.
All of them.
Well, so that is the question that could be raised to the engineering director. With the public works standards, as I understand it, there's a process for modifying the improvements, and we alluded to that a little bit before. We could talk a little bit about what the standard local street improvements might be, certain width of asphalt, curb, gutter, landscape strip, sidewalk, and then the engineering director has the authority through the public works standards to allow modifications to say maybe the sidewalk could be on a private property with a public easement over it. Maybe the landscape strip could be reduced or eliminated entirely. Maybe the asphalt width could be reduced so that it allowed for a vehicle travel lane, but not necessarily on-street parking. So there are options that could be entertained. And
we have a low. We have used at this point a low volume street design, and it's similar to what we've approved for 19th as the Woonurf design on 19th. The width is 15 feet of paved. Is that right?
I think it's 20.
No, I don't think it was 20 feet of paved. It was clear 20 feet. And with potential gravel shoulders, but it was I think there was less pavement than that. And I'm not sure if Chuck's in the back there, he might be able to verify that.
Yeah, we don't have a low volume street standard that's been formally adopted into the public works standards, but a concept was developed for 19th Avenue.
And we've used it, I think, once.
And 19th is no curb and no sidewalk, correct?
No, there's a curb.
It's a curb at the edge of asphalt.
Okay, I guess it is a curb at the edge.
Well, there isn't today, but in the design, there was a curbed edge on that with the asphalt. And that low volume standard is an option.
So so really what I want to make sure that I understand, what you're asking the applicant to do is not to actually put in sidewalks or gutters. What you're asking is just to asphalt the road.
Well, not necessarily. I mean, I think the starting point would be an expectation of full regular street improvements, and that's where you start. And then you entertain, as the engineering director, you entertain requests for modifying that given the character or the conditions of the street. And so I think what I'd want to say is that my understanding is we are open to the flexibility that's allowed through the public works standards. So if, for example, it was felt that it was more important to try to preserve at least one, if not more, of those trees there, more important to do that than to have on-street parking on an improved shell lane, then, that could be considered. And the idea could be maybe, there's still a minimum width of asphalt that might be needed to have sufficient vehicle travel, but a tree could potentially be saved. I think our feeling is that given the location of this tree, it is probably in a spot where it could be left in place and we could get some minimal improvement, but that's something that would be kind of figured out in the context of a modification.
I looked at the site today, and it looks like if you extended the curb that's currently going down Shell, it would pass right to the edge of the trunk, which we do understand is a little too close to go, but that's without removing parking. That's keeping that same on-street parking as the rest of Shell does right now.
Some of these other trees a little farther to the south may not be in quite as good a position to all be retained, but that could be looked at.
They're more in the center of that right-of-way, and they all in the center of what would be the travel lane potentially, and they also are really not in nearly as good a shape as that other tree. Most of them have a split. They're just a single stump with. I'm not an arborist, but they're not healthy-looking trees. But they're trees, you know. There's a lot of growth there, but they're not a really attractive tree like the one in front.
But I guess, again, to just reiterate, there is some flexibility in the standards for some variation or modification of improvements, reducing or eliminating certain elements.
Okay, so I want to understand how we got to this point today, where the applicant has a timeline, which I would assume that the city would have known the minute that they turned in their plans. So why is the applicant saying that they just got notification of this 4 days ago? Why wasn't this discussed at the beginning?
Well, fair question. When we had the pre-application conference, to be fair, and we prepared notes for that, there was a reflection in the pre-app notes that the building addition by itself was enough to require some improvements, and that there would be an analysis of proportionality for Shell Lane in particular, that Lake Road was, I think, already improved to standard. So there was some indication of it early on. As we were obviously a little bit delayed pulling the staff report and draft findings together, we didn't make our normal deadline of a week before the hearing. So the specifics of our conditions arrived late to the applicant in terms of understanding what we were going to actually put out there for the recommended findings and conditions. There's certainly a willingness on the part of the staff to work with the timelines that the applicant has expressed some concern about in terms of trying to figure out how to structure the timing of certain things so the project is able to move forward, the bulk of the project could move forward, and we can have, maintain some leverage or some insurance that what we feel the required improvements will be done. So that was one of the points I was going to say in a rebuttal opportunity, was just to make clear that, one, there's flexibility for an opportunity for modifying some improvements, and two, that we're certainly open to tweaking. And in this case, what was referenced, as Andrew referenced it, was some of the timing of the additional requirements. We're feeling less inclined to budge on the condition to require some improvements, but certainly can explore options for the timing so that it works for the district. I don't think anybody wants them to lose a year for the project.
And Brett, what you're saying is, in the additional requirements, as Andrew mentioned, C and D being tied to February 2019 as meeting that by that time frame.
Right. Yeah, I think for one, they're not conditions. They're kind of included here as requirements, and we try to structure them in a way so that it's clear for the applicant when certain things will be required. I believe that there's some flexibility with engineering as well on some of that timing. So if we need to caucus briefly to figure out if a date certain will work for those couple elements, it's possible they could be tied to some other timeline.
Yeah. And keep in mind that, I understand the full engineered plans is significant time. The application of the permit is $250, and they apply for a permit. So that's a relatively small component to this. It's just that things are kind of being tracked, and there's an open application.
Do we have any contractual infrastructure within the city to allow the applicant to enter into a covenant with the city for a certain period of time to allow them to either fulfill the requirements of this condition or apply for an adjustment or a modification? Basically to give them time to evaluate, to talk to the neighborhood, work with city staff.
For the public improvement part of things?
Correct.
Not sure.
I'm not sure I followed your question exactly. You said a covenant so an agreement with them to have that happen?
It's a process that I have experience with City of Portland where contentious, particularly like non-conforming uses, non-conforming upgrades, you can, in lieu of performing those, enter into a covenant and agreement with the city stating that the applicant will either complete the conditions of approval, complete the conforming upgrades or whatever they may be, or apply for an adjustment or a modification and go through that process with the city.
But we actually sort of expect if the condition if you approve the condition, we would expect them to apply for a modification to our standards and negotiate the type of improvement that actually gets built. The way this timing all occurred is they did not respond to the notes that were given in the pre-app notes and did not propose any improvements on Shell Lane. So as we reviewed the application, we said they haven't put anything on Shell Lane, so we're going to condition that. So we did not have the opportunity to really enter into negotiation about what that might be in advance. You know, I mean, we can take some blame in that about not calling them right away when we saw that that wasn't that they weren't proposing any improvements there. But the way it, you know, everybody's got a lot going on, and the way the timing worked is we called them last week about it, and then have had a couple of phone calls about it, trying to work out some kind of language in the agreement that, or in the conditions that weren't so specific that it left some option open there, but provided some flexibility.
But I guess it seems like, given that short timeline, regardless of why it happened, that it's a lose-lose for the applicant and for the city, and that there is some potential to force the construction of street improvements that may not ultimately be appropriate for the condition.
I'm not speculating. You're saying
it just seems like there needs to be more time and more evaluation to this, rather than asking us to approve a condition or to recommend a condition of approval tonight for a community service use that I think we all speculatively are in agreement and in support of.
I think one of the, how we understand, and correct me if I run off the rails here, what we understand is that the proposed improvement does hit a threshold of impact that warrants some improvements. And when we...
I'm going to jump in.
Okay.
Which would imply that the school district is responsible for every public frontage they have. For one reason or another, they did not and were not required to do improvements the last time they touched this section. We're not clear about that. Chuck's moving up here, so it's Chuck, there's a microphone right here that you can use.
I guess I can add one thing too, is that part of their argument that no one's going to be accessing that from this site because that's not where their driveway is, would lead to some very interesting driveway configurations of driveways only accessing lake or the other side of a frontage, just so they don't deal with their other frontage. So that's not a part of this kind of calculation.
We do allow performance bonds in lieu of the actual permits being pulled at the time of building permits. So we do have a procedure to allow a building permit to be issued as long as we have a performance guarantee of the frontage improvements.
But that performance bond would not allow the opportunity to apply for an adjustment or a modification, it would require that.
It would have a fixed value to it, but it would not have a defined alignment unless they could prepare that ahead of time. Yes, it would. So it would be totally up to the applicant. Our codes are set up for a standard configuration, with the applicant having the authority to ask for modifications.
So they would ask for modifications before we'd figure out a bond thing, right? Before they would develop a cost estimate for improvements. So, I mean, a partial answer to your question, I think, is that there is a process for them to request a modification or an adjustment to what might be a standard street improvement.
And then sometimes we do we have requirements that take place throughout a permit process. We'll say, before you get your permit, this has to happen, but before you get framing, maybe something that's a month or two down the road, you have to do this. So we could push back when these requirements have to take place.
And as an additional clarification, a demo permit is not a building permit in our minds. So they can get their demo permit anytime. That's
okay.
And so the performance bond, the fixed value, would be based on the 2/3 street.
Unless they proposed a modification, you're right.
Yeah, there would be some back and forth to determine what that cost of their improvement's going to be. So there's a little bit of engineering that goes into it, but it's not design plans by any means.
Are we able to grant them that flexibility, like maybe with the 1 year out, deadline or whatever, and then, no other timelines are affected? They don't have to rush and get some engineering design done or anything for the performance bond, and, we just have the condition that all that gets worked out within the next year, or with all of, the flexibility that's, would go into that, or would that not be advisable?
I guess we could, just because there is some time that's involved with figuring out what that amount is, we could maybe push that to framing, or prior to final occupancy, they need to have that bond in place.
Well, if it's tied to the conditional use, it would also, if they don't carry out the conditions of the conditional use, you can find them in violation of the conditional use. And that, assuming a judge believes that they're also in violation of the conditional use, they could be fined every day that they remain in violation. So after the year, if you haven't resolved it, I mean, that's not a pleasant way to go, but it's the other way to deal with conditional uses.
I don't see any issues from an engineering perspective.
So you'd be comfortable with a 1 year?
That would be totally within your privy, in my mind. Typically, the way these things happen is that if somebody comes in, if they didn't need a community service thing from you, they would come in for the building permit, and we would put the requirement on at the time of building permit.
Right.
So.
One thing we might keep an eye on, and we might ask for some more feedback from the applicant team, is in the language of condition 2, we included a couple of sentences. One that says all required frontage improvements shall be completed prior to any high school or other athletic events not associated with prior existing uses. So that was kind of our one anchor point. And then we said a performance bond may be provided as an alternative to constructing the required improvements within this required time frame. And I think what we should check and try to understand is if the mechanics of getting a performance bond, if they require full engineered plans, and the applicant thinks that may take longer than when they're going to want to start using the revised field setup, then maybe we need to explore if there's a different way to structure that for timing, so that we don't think we're solving the problem and end up keeping the trap in there.
You might just want to strike it, actually. Because if we get the performance bond, or if we have some other agreement about how it's being done, it might not make any difference.
Yeah.
I mean, I'd be comfortable with that, because the performance bond is enough of a legal instrument to, effectively guarantee that it's going to happen. And so if it's offset a little bit by timeline-wise by, the use becoming active, versus when the improvements actually get constructed. If we have a guarantee that the improvements will be constructed, and that's according to some contractual obligation, then I think that's fine. I don't see any reason to have the double condition that might be a gotcha, just like Denny was saying.
Okay, so within condition 2, remove the statement, all required frontage improvements shall be completed prior to any high school or athletic events not associated with prior existing uses.
Chair, may I make a suggestion at this point in time? Unless if the applicant has a rebuttal to what has been happening here, that we take a 5 to 7 minute break and let the city and the applicant talk about how maybe they want to handle this with a non-tying agreement to final occupancy or to getting permits to slow down the construction of the building in towards the right-of-way.
Okay, a break has been suggested.
Does that make sense?
Does that work for everybody? Okay, well.
I guess if they wanted to, I don't know if they had an answer. I think that was part of your question as well.
Yeah, if they have a rebuttal to this where they say, no, we don't even want to discuss it with it, we think that we're in the right, I don't know if they want to discuss it or not again.
Let's go ahead and take a break and come back at 8:05. Just a quick break. Then we'll
already on air.
I know. Do I just like start talking once it comes on, or?
There it is.
Great. Okay, welcome back from our break. Thank you, Brett. You were talking. Do you have additional things to state? Do we have additional questions, or do we go to rebuttal from the applicant? Where do we start this process?
I think we have additional comments from staff.
Additional comments from staff. Okay.
Yeah. Well, yeah, let me not lose the opportunity to make a couple comments, but first I'll just address what we just talked about with the applicant, and that was going to be a suggestion for revising the conditions, particularly condition number 2. The suggestion was to strike, it's the third sentence that says, all required frontage improvements shall be completed prior to any high school or other athletic events not associated with prior uses. And to additionally strike the final phrase of the next sentence so that it would simply read, a performance bond may be provided as an alternative to constructing the required improvements, period, because the within this required time frame seemed to relate back to the sentence we just struck. So strike the third sentence and the phrase within this required time frame from the following sentence, the fourth one. And then with respect to the additional requirements, our suggestion, and after talking with the applicant, was that we can leave 1C as it is, because it's actually very easy to apply, to obtain a right-of-way permit. You don't need full engineered plans for that. And with respect to additional requirement 1D, we would add a phrase so that it would read, submit full engineered plans for construction of all required public improvements, comma, or provide a performance guarantee, comma, and then continue, reviewed and approved by the City of Milwaukee Engineering Department. That would clarify that there's that options to provide some kind of assurance that that we'll get the improvements planned out. So those are the two changes that we seem to come to some agreement on.
And does that also include the Exhibit 1 that was earlier presented as well?
Yeah, fair to restate that, yeah, we would continue to suggest that you, or to recommend that you adopt or incorporate the language, the strikeout and underline language in Exhibit 1 for that particular findings 10D and 10E. And then just to follow up on a couple of the comments and questions that came up. I've already noted that the city's willing to be flexible with respect to timing, and that's what we just talked about. But that we continue to assert that the new square footage of the building does have an impact as per the kind of the methodology that we use for that, and that there is a nexus and proportionality for the requirements. We've discussed and kind of, I think, inherent in the flexibility that we have with the modification or adjustment process for those improvements, the question about would some or all the trees be removed, it does remain to be seen. It seems that at least with the large one that's by itself here, closest to the existing driveway, it seems like there's adequate room to get some of the minimal improvements that we would need and to keep the tree in place. I'm not sure that the situation is quite the same with some of these other trees here, but that would all be evaluated, I guess. And we could certainly take the commission's, I guess, suggestion if you feel that that's a higher priority than providing some more on-street parking on Shell Lane, as you were noting or discussing some of the concerns about parking. With respect to neighbors and notice, I would just say that that's kind of a mixed bag. I mean, we did provide the standard 20-day notice of the application to properties within 300 feet. They got the basic information about the application and the link to the project webpage that had the applicant materials and a note about when the staff report was supposed to be available for that. But yeah, we certainly have not done specific outreach, especially since we just developed these conditions to talk to those particular neighbors on Shell Lane about this. Yeah, I think I'll leave it there unless you have any other thoughts, or Alex or Chuck. So if you have any other questions.
So the applicant provided examples from the ITE trip generation manual for these other uses. What is the city's position as far as, I mean, in including these other uses in, I mean, the measurements? I mean, is this relevant basically to our authority in making this decision, or is this just kind of guidance?
You mean the information that was provided in the applicant's letter?
The letter today. And so they show that under the existing configuration that there's a baseball field 1 and 2 and tennis court 1 and 2, and those, combine for a certain, number of trips per ITE. And then the reconfiguration would, include other, another mishmash of, a combination of uses, and those would combine for, basically a delta of 3.73 additional PM peak trips. So I'm just wondering, is that even something that we get to consider based on the code, or is this just guidance?
I might jump into that one.
Thank you.
Your code section that's applicable, I think, is 19705.2, which is addressed in the application at page 29. And it identifies factors that are considered in proportionality. So your suggestion that this is a consideration but not necessarily controlling, I think, is correct. Second comment I'd make with respect to proportionality is that your code language is what's important here, not the Nolan-Dolan analysis, because that applies to the protection of private property, and the school district does not own private property, it owns public property.
Yeah. Thank you for that clarification.
Just for the record, the calculations that were done for that, although itemized out, they do make sense. That's not how we would calculate the trip generation for the site. If it was an empty site right now and they came in for a school, and I kind of talked about this earlier with the 9 tennis courts, if they had a ball field and a basketball court and a couple tennis courts, that would all be incidental to the school. It wouldn't change the trip generation. If they had a 50,000 square foot building, it'd be some certain number of trips. If they didn't have any fields, in violation of the code or whatnot, it wouldn't change the trip generation for the site. So for them to itemize it out separately is a little bit disingenuous, because that's not how we calculate it in the first place.
Right.
We understand the field's used differently, but for our calculation for requiring the improvements, we're just looking at how we would calculate the site for what's being built, and it's the square footage increase.
We debated this internally quite a bit, and we had thought about trying to count the high school trip separately, because the high school use is not part of that middle school use, and just decided for simplicity's sake to just rely on the square footage. But yeah, we went round and round on that.
Let me just check to see if I'm correct as well, that if the school is being proposed as new, like so vacant site, we're getting a new middle school with athletic fields, and the understanding was that the fields were mostly going to be used for PE and recess, but that part of the proposal with establishing the new school was also to have some high school athletic activities there. Would we think about more than the building square footage in calculating the number of trips, or trying to, probably the establishing of a new school would be roughly proportional to improvements on all the frontages. So maybe it would be a moot point, and maybe it would be more of a question about the CSU part of it. But I don't know if that's a fair question to say. If I was giving you a middle school and fields that included some use by another school off-site, would you then do a trip calculation based on the school square footage and this one baseball field or these 4 tennis courts that are actually going to be used for another use, or do we just stick with the building square footage?
I think I'll jump in there on that.
Way to go, Brett.
So basically, Our methodology that we have adopted addresses the building only. All fields are ancillary. So we do not look at it ever.
No matter who's using them.
Right.
So then, if Lake Road, for instance, wasn't up to the city code, then we would be looking at prioritizing the Lake Road frontage, and the proportionality would come into play by saying, we're not going to have you upgrade or reconstruct Shell Lane because we need you to work on Lake Road. However, Lake Road's already done. And so the intent is that we would then proceed to another frontage that would be of a lower priority.
Move to the next priority, yes.
So then, as part of the community service use, which is equivalent to a conditional use, I mean, really what we're talking about here is an R10 district. And so the expectation is if this land was being used for its comprehensive plan designated purpose, there would be houses back there and they would have frontage improvements. So part of mitigating the community service use, the different type of use in the R10 district would be bringing these roads up to standards, right? I mean, it's...
Yep.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to say it.
I just want to be sure about one thing. You keep saying that the frontage street improvements are for off-street parking, correct?
Well, that's not the only purpose of them. But I mean, depending on how a street gets built, it can provide on-street parking. Wait, I'm not sure I understand.
That's what I meant, on-street parking. You've said that a couple of times that, you'll get additional on-street parking with these improvements.
If it's made wide enough, if it's not modified to exclude on-street parking. That's part of the question is
right. So my question comes if that is the priority, and we know that their maximum is 66 parking spaces required by code, and they're at 81, then is there a secondary reason just besides code?
For getting street improvements?
Yes.
Well, the street improvements is not just for parking.
Right. So what's a secondary reason?
It's the new impact on the transportation system, the increased impact.
To a dead-end road.
Well, but for vehicle travel, for pedestrian travel.
Okay.
Do we have the option of attaching a condition that would require the street improvements to display no parking signs, just to avoid an impact on the neighborhood in that way?
You mean don't improve but put up signs?
No, improve, but make it narrow enough that there's no parking. No parking would be allowed on the street.
I don't know if a condition is necessary for that so much as what our standard practice might be for when we have a street of a certain width. I don't know if it's responding as well to a request that if we wouldn't necessarily put up no parking signs.
We might have to put up the signs if a final design is narrow enough that if someone parks, they would violate the fire width. Then yeah, I think we would probably put them up.
We have to put them up yourself.
Yeah. My concern would be that you create new parking spaces, you induce new trips, and you invite people to park there, and then you're adding all of this extra traffic and turnaround traffic. I mean, all this, whatever the frontage is, and however many cars you can actually fit down there. But that creates an impact on those properties, down at the end of the road. And so if there was an opportunity to attach a condition that the road not be improved to include room for parking, to avoid, again, the impact on those properties.
I think to the extent that you can relate that limitation to compliance with an approval criteria, you would have the authority to impose that.
Okay. Thank you. We have the opportunity for rebuttal. Does the applicant have any rebuttal or additional comments in response to the public testimony?
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. If it's all right, I'll start. All right, I'm going to go way back to Mr. Lanoff's testimony and say that we appreciate his comments tonight. And I think the district's ongoing position is that when not in school use, that absolutely is public property, and we're glad that he enjoys it. Hopefully, he'll find a way to enjoy the additional improvements to the fields, including the covered play area. For Oregon schools, that's an absolute necessity. So we're happy to bring that to the community. I wanted to just touch for a moment upon the potential for retaining the trees that are shown in question here. As part of this design process, we're going to need to get an arborist involved. I mean, really, the improvements, sort of as they're aligned, are going to come very close to the trunk and to the critical root zones of these trees. It's hard to say with any certainty what's going to be retained and what's not. That said, my partner, one of the civil engineers at 3J, was involved in the pervious parking lot discussion in the 2010 application. And there's a couple of interesting points there. As we were looking at that right-of-way, it looked to us at that point like that tree was in serious jeopardy. It's a 55-inch tree, but we never proceeded to design because I think the public hearings were quite, I'm missing a word here, but there were a lot of neighbors out in opposition of seeing improvements out there, and they cited parking and tree retention and the like. So, in concluding our presentation, I think that we've done a very reasonable job in explaining that the impacts to this, both the potential impacts and then the actual impacts, are going to be extremely low. I think staff has concurred with that in their report by mentioning a couple times that they're not expecting any changes to the neighborhoods as a report of this or as a result of this application. I think the district has gone a long way to try and mitigate any potential impacts by setting up this bus program, by moving students in and out of the facility without causing additional traffic impacts during one of the peak PM hours when you wouldn't necessarily want a whole bunch of trips coming and competing with pickup and drop-off traffic. I think it is totally possible for the Planning Commission to conclude that based upon the information in the record, the district's mitigation of the impacts, that there are not sufficient impacts to trigger any improvements to this particular section of Shell Lane. I think that's a possible conclusion for you to come to tonight. I will say that if you decide to go in the other direction and require improvements from Shell Lane, the district will feel a financial impact to this. The bond program has been planned out for many years. This was not part of the project when we initially brought it to the table. On behalf of the district, we would ask that you would direct staff, suggest to staff that they be allowed to consider the full range of flexibility and design modification reductions available to us if we end up having to design and complete improvements within that right-of-way.
I think just to capitalize on that last point is it would be great if we have to go that direction, if you see that you need to put this condition of approval in place, that really trying to direct staff at the minimal improvements that are required for this versus the starting point, which is as they indicated before. If we start working on that end of things, that would certainly benefit us from a budget, financial, timing, everything standpoint for this particular approval if we need to get there.
With that, we'll take any questions.
Any questions before we close the public testimony portion of the hearing?
Are you willing to consider any additional transportation demand management opportunities or plans or anything? I mean, you keep saying, you'd take even more parking than you have now. Well, I mean, the code's pretty clear about the parking at middle schools being 2 per classroom. So in addition, if you go over and above what the code calls for, you're creating more of an impact on the transportation system than the code intends from your given use. So I'm just really curious, why do you need so much parking? Why can't you manage it like any other middle school in the city would have to, at two spots per classroom. I mean, why is the parking so important? And I mean, what else could you offer us so that you could say that you're actually reducing the impact on the transportation system below what code calls for?
I think that's a very interesting question. So just to make sure we're all on the same page, the current limit for parking at the school, if we didn't have a modification in place, would be 66 parking stalls. Because there was a 2007 modification, the school was allowed to place 85 parking stalls on the site. The school, various restriping efforts, repainting, whatever happens in the course of normal maintenance, apparently some additional parking stalls have shown up. So there's 89 today. We're removing 8 of them, which puts us 4 stalls below that 85 parking stall cap that we have. I think we'd like them back. I mean, we would propose if we could to put them back in, but I don't think we could get plans ready to show for that tonight. But I think, as David mentioned earlier, there's a real demand for student pickup and drop-off. Schools these days operate a little differently than they did when I was even going to school and in years past. There's not as many students walking to school. There's not quite as many students using the bus as there used to be. I think that's not only in Milwaukee, but across a lot of the school districts where we're working on projects. That's what we're sort of seeing, is a reduced busing demand. I think what you're seeing is a lot of parents who want to drop off their kids and pick up their kids from school. And maybe it's an overarching safety concern based upon what's going on in the world these days, or maybe it's something else. Maybe more people just have cars on the roads. I'm not sure what it is. But there certainly are significant demands at those PM and AM drop-off peak hours, and a lot of folks parking and getting out of their cars to escort their kids. The parking, I almost wonder if it bears consideration of the parking standard to ask whether or not that's still relevant, or as relevant as it was when it was put in place. In terms of transportation management demand, this school is not located as conveniently to Max Line and some of the other regional-wide transportation networks that are available elsewhere in Milwaukee, at the high school, for example. Talking with TriMet may be a solution to add more frequent service in that area, but at the end of the day, that may not help, because you may still have parents who want to be involved actively in the drop-off and pickup. Does that answer your question?
I mean, just sort of. I mean, it's really, it's a catch-22, because more people want to drop off their kids. Well, that creates more of a safety hazard for the people who may choose to walk or bike from the site. And so, I mean, what are the goals to bring the building back, the use back into compliance with the city's intentions? I mean, there's a safety concern here, there's climate goal concerns here, there's traffic, quality of life concerns here. I mean, there's a lot of things wrapped up in just allowing people to drive anywhere they want, whenever they want, just because they want. So, I mean, what are we going to do to try to bring the school back into better compliance and address some of this stuff? Because, we're again, with the variance or with the modification that was approved 10 years ago, you're creating, an additional impact, on the system above and beyond what the code calls for and what our engineering, standards are designed. I mean, it all interrelates. All of the rules interrelate with each other, and the rules are being bent for a middle school for parking. And I just don't, and it creates more of a safety hazard, more air quality concerns, more climate concerns, more all of these concerns. And so, I'm very concerned about the fact that there's extra parking already allocated, and that we're only really going to, do the minimum 3 carpool spots, and then, you're trying to get out of upgrading this frontage, that would be the next priority in line with upgrading all of the frontages around the site, while at the same time you're creating this extra impact on the transportation system. Even if it's not on that stretch of road, you're still creating this extra transportation impact. I mean, those parking spaces induce trips. If they weren't there, those trips would not be induced. People would find other ways to travel. And so I really think that, I'm very concerned about this. And so I'm hoping that, maybe you would offer, some additional steps that you'd be willing to take. So, especially since you're asking us to look the other way from the code as far as what the improvements for the transportation system would be. I mean, that's really the intersection here as far as I'm concerned, is that you're asking us to look the other way on the code, but at the same time, you're creating more of a burden on the transportation system than the code intends for your use.
I may just clarify to say we're not asking anyone to look the other way on the code. I think the adjustment in 2007 to allow for additional parking, although I don't have it in front of me, it was justified, and your code allows for adjustments to code under certain conditions. The Planning Commission at that time must have felt that those conditions were met, and they granted the adjustment and approved the application. By reducing the parking by 1, we're moving closer into compliance with the code. We happen to be reducing it by 4, but it's not to say that we're wrongly out of compliance or that anyone looked the other way or ignored the code in 2007 when that was approved, nor are we asking for you to ignore the code or the public works standards in the design of this code. As city staff has mentioned, it's a very flexible design standard within the right-of-way. We're just asking, if you are so inclined, to encourage staff to allow us to go with the cheapest possible option within that particular section of the right-of-way, because it's not going to be a high-demand travel area. It's going to be the end of a dead-end road. So if there's flexibility they can afford to us, we would appreciate your encouragement of them to give it to us.
And I might just add, Commissioner Edge, I think that, the trips and the parent drop-off and pickup is not necessarily a demand on the parking spaces. I think that, the employees and staff are utilizing and filling those parking spots, the parents. So I guess that the argument about trip generation, and by having the parking spots, you're encouraging parents to do the drop-off and pickup. I'm less inclined to go that route, but I'd prefer not to debate that any further. I do think that there is a concern about employee parking, just being there during not even during drop-off or pickup time. All the spots are filled, so they're not filled by parents. They're filled by employees of the school, as far as I can tell, unless there are parents there during visiting hours. So it's less about trip generation for me. It's less about the issue with the parents, but more about ensuring that the faculty and staff of the school have adequate parking facilities.
I have no
additional?
questions.
Okay. Okay.
Thank you again.
Thanks.
Okay, I will close the public testimony portion of this hearing. The public testimony portion of hearing CSU-2017-010 is now closed. Yeah, twice.
That's all right. Good girl. Don't break it, though. Peachtree.
Discussion by commissioners. Is the commission ready for discussion?
Yes.
Yes.
Great. Let's hear from someone we haven't heard from yet.
I'm sorry, can I get a clarifying question from you, Commissioner Travis, or Chair Travis? Could you please, I know that you wrote it down fairly well, and in the modified version that the city gave us, in additional requirements number 1D, I have submit full engineered plans for construction of all required public improvements, or provide a
performance bond, reviewed and approved by the City of Milwaukee Engineering Department.
I think we suggested performance guarantee.
Performance guarantee. Oh.
Thank you. I'll let somebody else step in if they would like to speak.
Commissioner Argo.
Okay. As to the questions about parking
This is wrong.
that relate with trip generation, as Commissioner Edge noted. I do believe that's the kind of policy level discussion that really has to come with advocates and with city staff and with the district staff on making efforts utilizing organizations like Safe Routes to School if there is a popular or a good drive from the community to be able to enact TDM type measures. It's not within the purview of the applicant. I am inclined to accept the conditions on 2 as suggested from Brett written. And it's going to be fun to try to raise a motion for that, because I think we're also going to try to read in Exhibit 1's language. But anyway, that's where I come from, because of the fact that the frontage is part of an overall assessment that the engineer in the Public Works did in review, and I think that in principle I accept that that's our methodology of getting improvements in things to standard, or being flexible enough to come to an agreement on a type of minimal impact, acceptable design for Shell Lane. So that is my inclination here, that we can go with the language as amended, as suggested by Brett.
Okay, and then the applicant asked if we were willing to add in language around directing staff to explore the flexibility around the minimal improvement requirements.
Well, I'm inclined.
Do you feel like that's?
I'm inclined to agree with, or to accept that.
To accept that as well as and to number 2.
Yeah, but I did want to hear everybody.
Yeah.
Where their take is on these aspects.
We'll go in order. Go ahead.
I'm inclined to agree as well. I think that giving them the flexibility that they need to be able to move ahead on their timelines and not, incur the full additional cost, as much as possible. I mean, it makes sense, but we need to make sure that we're that we're requiring the frontage improvements on the next priority frontage, each time, and I think it's important not to, ignore that the community service use is a conditional use. This is supposed to be resident. I mean, the design, the intention is this is residential land, and if this was a subdivision, they would have to, provide curbs and paved streets and everything, especially including along this frontage. And so giving them the flexibility, to work with the timing and the budget, constraints and everything, but to move ahead on their timeline, I think is appropriate. And as much as that we're allowed or that we have the flexibility to give staff guidance, I think that we can, guide them towards, a lower cost solution, try to save, the trees if we can, manage to do so. And I think that's all very appropriate. I just want to, make sure that we are, taking advantage of the opportunity to, get the next highest frontage dealt with.
As being, I'll look at this from a different perspective. As being a tax-paying citizen and knowing that everyone in this who lives in the district is on the hook for this, we are asking the applicant to improve a road that goes to nowhere. And it seems absolutely ridiculous. But, believe it or not, the applicant changed my mind, because he is so desperate to get more parking back. So by golly, we should improve that frontage road, and we should allow at least 4 or 5 more spots to get back into that parking situation as on-street parking. So I am with Argo, and I am with Commissioner Jones.
Edge.
What? Edge. And I agree with requiring what has been negotiated with minimal, with consideration towards minimal requirements.
Right?
I don't think there's much more that I can say that the other commissioners have said. I would obviously not want to slow up their development timeline. It sounds pretty short. I would be in favor of minimal requirements since we are, it's standard practice for our engineering code. And I think if we can just condition that the minimal requirements, I don't necessarily know that they need to go, full as the condition is now. But I think the planning staff has demonstrated that they are in favor of being very flexible in that regard. And so I would just encourage them to do so.
I don't really have a lot else to add. I think that this language allows the applicant the flexibility to move forward and explore possible modifications and work in conjunction with the city to come to the right solution. So I'm in support.
Okay. Is it too late to add something about surveying existing employees about, I think trying to get the parking spots right would be, value added. And so is there some kind of language that we can add around ensuring or applicant will do further analysis with staff to examine parking needs? No.
I think we need a little more specificity than that.
I think to determine whether or not the on-street parking needs to be there or not.
Okay.
So if some sort of survey was done to the current staff, the FTs of the school, if that was overwhelmingly, to get those 4 spots back. I mean, otherwise, I would be inclined again
to allow
the minimum. Unless there was a demonstrated need for those additional parking spots. I think Kim has a good point.
Help me if I'm wrong here, but we could say with minimal requirements regarding a parking survey done by the school itself, or?
Yeah, I guess I would be asking if, in order to determine whether or not that level of street improvement is required, that there would be some kind of analysis done about usage of staff, which could include, the additional uses as per the fields and the tennis courts and so forth, but to have some kind of formal analysis of use of existing sites and then the need for, if we were going to suggest that the street parking were part of the improvements.
I'm getting kind of mixed messages here, I think, in a way. It's like minimal improvements, but if the school feels like they need more parking, we should maybe not make the minimal improvements and provide some on-street parking.
Correct.
I wonder if it sounds like part of the direction that the commission could give staff to consider or be inclined in the direction of minimal street improvements with consideration of and some evaluation of current parking demand.
Yes.
Can that, what I was asking Tim about earlier was, does this necessarily need to be in a condition, or in your motion, can you give us that direction to not only investigate or be inclined towards minimal improvements, but considering parking demand or current parking demand?
I think it's not necessary to put it in the condition. we know if you get that direction from the Planning Commission, you'll take it. So I think as long as you give clear direction to do that, that'll happen.
Okay.
Does that also include we also then would just make that not as part of the condition with minimal requirements as well? That would just be a recommendation?
Part of it, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
We do not have to add that into the condition. It is on the record that we are advising in that way.
Okay.
I mean, given the opportunity, anybody, that would add more parking. So I think that they would add more parking if, we gave them an inch to do it, and that's why we have parking maximums. That's why there's a maximum standard.
I would give you that debate, but what we are giving them is the opportunity to either spend the money for more parking off-site or on street, right?
Yeah.
Let them play that out, because the applicant, although they don't want to pay for the street improvement, has this desperate need of getting more parking. So we're giving them the two options that they're asking for.
Okay.
It's a win-win. Can I make my motion?
Yeah, I would now entertain a motion.
I would like to make a motion to approve the application adoptions of findings of approval found in Attachment 1, including Exhibit 1, and with modifications to Condition Number 2, eliminating sentence, all required frontage improvements shall be completed prior to any high school or other athletic events not associated with prior existing uses, and eliminating the phrase within the required time frame. Also modify in additional requirements, number 1D, to read, submit full engineer plans for construction of all required public improvements or provide a performance guarantee reviewed and approved by City of Milwaukee Engineering Department.
I'll second that motion.
Great. Motion by Commissioner Heimer and seconded by Commissioner Argo. All those in favor? Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Hearing none, the motion passes.
Chair, I'd also like to make a recommendation that we ask the city to please take the advice of looking at minimal requirements with the road improvements on Shell Lane, with parking demand as a basis of priority.
Okay.
It's in the record.
It's on the record. Great. If anyone wishes to appeal this decision to the City Council, you must make application stating the grounds for your appeal within 15 days of the mailing of the notice of decision. Please see planning staff for details. Okay.
Thank you, guys.
Yeah, thank you very much. We'll be seeing you again.
Yes, once or twice.
Yes. Okay, so next on the agenda, we have work session items.
We don't have anything for you tonight.
Thank you, Denny. Planning Department, other business / updates.
I covered them during information.
I would like to bring up updates and other business. So last meeting that we had, I basically had asked the city to contact their lawyer because I believe that they were in violation of Goal 1 in their public participation process during the comprehensive plan. Did we get any resolved or any commitment to that?
We're in the process of adding neighborhood representatives.
Okay, thank you.
We had to add 2.
Thank you.
We've discussed the problem.
Other updates, other business? Okay, Planning Commission committee updates and discussion items. As mentioned, we have our next Comprehensive Plan Advisory Committee meeting on Monday, and there will be a town hall in early April.
Yeah, I think it's April 6th.
Yeah,
but
he
I'm
landed a date, correct? We got it.
Is it April 4th? Or April 6th. I don't know. Can't remember.
I'm not sure.
Got a date. That's not much on it.
It's either a Monday or a Wednesday. I know that.
I think it's April 6th.
The 6th is a Friday.
Well, it's
4th
not
is
the
a
6th.
Wednesday.
It's probably the 4th.
2nd is a Monday.
Are you looking right now, Denny?
I'm looking, but I'm not seeing it on my calendar.
We can,
It's the 4th.
Thank you.
April 4th. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, great. And then forecast for future meetings.
We have a series of high school and library hearings, so just buckle in.
Buckle up.
So CSU.
Save the children.
Yeah. Okay. Great.
Thanks, staff, all staff, you guys, very much.
Okay, with nothing more, we'll go ahead and adjourn the meeting. Thank you.
Got to make
sorry.
a motion.
Oh, I would like to have a motion to adjourn the meeting.
I move to adjourn.
Seconded.
All right. All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? No. Okay.
I seriously doubt you'd get an opposition for that.
Thanks, Tim.
Thank you.